Okay, hello and welcome to part one of a two-part lecture on the city in Robert Louis Stevenson's strange case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. So the first part of this lecture is going to concentrate on urban Gothic, and the second part is going to look at mapping the city through mobility in the flaneur, and we'll get onto that with the second lecture if you tune into that to find out more. My name is Sophie Raine, and I'm a PhD student working in the Department of English Literature and Creative Writing at Lancaster University. My research focuses on spaces in the city in Victorian popular texts such as Penny Dreadfuls. Okay, and I'm really interested in how these texts kind of interact with the city, as well as kind of looking at areas of kind of urban Gothic as well. So this workshop will consist of me guiding you through the text and offering some interpretations of Jekyll and Hyde. But there'll also be opportunities for you to pause the recording and reflect upon some questions yourself. Okay, and this will help you to kind of understand and analyse the text in a more critical way. Okay, so just for a general sort of overview of what we're going to be looking at. So first of all, I'm going to introduce you to what urban Gothic is, how the city is structured and laid out in the text, anonymity and criminality, and industrialization in the Gothic slum, and then I'll give you a brief summary. So first of all, what is urban Gothic? Okay, so many 18th century Gothic texts tended to be set in remote locations where protagonists were often isolated in this alienating place, and they were quite secluded from kind of people that they know and environments that they're familiar with. Settings for these were often things like castles and abbeys and convents and other quite archaic structures. So they're removing these characters to an unfamiliar place and increasing their sense of vulnerability. So texts like that include Horace Walpole's The Castle of Otranto, for example. So by the 19th century though, while we still do have some of these texts, Gothic migrates to the city, okay? And this is what Robert Mile calls urban Gothic mode, okay? So before I go on to explain a little bit more about what that entails, I'd like you to pause the video and consider these questions. So what is Gothic about the city and urban living? Consider both the Victorian city and our modern day contexts. Can you think of any other examples of urban Gothic texts? And finally, what is gained or lost, you might argue, by Stevenson choosing to set strange case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde in the metropolis? Okay, so if you just want to pause and just press play when you're ready to continue. Okay, so going through each of these questions now, we're going to start by thinking about what characterises the city as Gothic. So there are many things you might have noted down about the city that can be constructed as, that leads it to be constructed as a Gothic space. And many of these still apply to cities today. So firstly, we've got this labyrinthian design of the streets. This makes the city seem much less open because we have these multitude of different pathways, which causes citizens to feel quite overwhelmed, lost and vulnerable. So the terrifying solitude of the castle that I mentioned before in the 18th century is substituted for this chaotic disorder of the city. So next we have this kind of anonymity of city life. So the density in cities meant that people could move around in a seemingly untraceable way. So unlike smaller suburbs or rural areas, Victorian urban dwellers wouldn't have known everyone in the city, of course, and the sense of community was more fragmented in these densely populated areas. So this lack of community segregates citizens and makes them feel even more alone. So in addition to this, we have suspicions about who lives in this area due to this anonymity. People were obviously suspicious of the fact that they didn't know everybody who was in the city, and people could, as I said, move about in a seemingly untraceable way. So remember, this is the time we're also moving from this quite physical monster to a monster which kind of like who can blend in, the kind of human monster. And that again kind of contributes to this idea of anonymity and the fact that the criminal could be anyone. There is more about this on a video entitled Representing Good and Evil by Professor Camilla Elliott as part of the Lancaster series, which I'd recommend you reading if you want, sorry, you listening to if you want to know more about that. And finally, we have the slums in the East End of London, which were depicted by middle-class writers and social philanthropists such as Henry Mayhew and Andrew Means as dismal, bleak places that were riddled with crime. Okay, so yes, we're social philanthropists, so they're the people who would, often middle class, would go into these kind of these urban slums kind of almost as explorers in a way and report back their findings. And as I say, we'll talk a little bit more about that. I'm going to go through each of these points. So the second thing you asked was if you could think of any other examples. So here I have some Victorian examples. So we have Oliver Twist by Charles Dickens, 1837 to 38. Dickens kind of uses the city to show this kind of sense of vulnerability in Oliver Twist, and there is obviously all those connections to crime in those areas. And then we have a text you might not be as familiar with, which is The Mysteries of London by George W.M. Reynolds. So this is a penny dreadful, which, as you might have recalled, I mentioned at the start, is what I study specifically. So these were working class Victorian texts that were sold really cheaply every week, and they would have these quite sensational and melodramatic plot lines. The Mysteries of London it's excellent. It's quite a mammoth text. It is very, very long. It went on for about 12 years. And yeah, so that kind of, and Reynolds really does capitalize on this idea of the urban Gothic and the criminal that kind of is hiding within the city. And then a text you might be more familiar with at the end of the century is Picture Drawing Grey by Oscar Wilde. Okay. There are many kind of more modern day examples of urban Gothic as well in crime fiction, or for example, something like Gotham City in Batman, okay, is an example of urban Gothic as well. Okay, so Jekyll and Hyde in the city. So you'll, of course, have your own ideas about the merits or disadvantages of setting Jekyll and Hyde in the city. I think this choice actually works extremely well because it helps the presentation of a variety of themes that run throughout. So Hyde we have here is this kind of like typical sort of urban monster in a sense. And Jekyll is this Victorian gentleman, kind of shows this kind of dichotomy of the criminal, okay, and the easy way that they can kind of slip through society, kind of unnoticed almost, okay, and how easily he would have walked alongside his readers. So more about the methods Hyde uses to evade the law are due to the structure and city living. So when I talk about these structures, I'm talking about both physical structures, like the alleyways that I mentioned that are able to help them sort of avoid being detected or kind of stalked through the streets by Utterson, but also the kind of power structures within the city. So moving through the city as well, terror has been localised and was geographically mappable rather than an exotic or distant location set in the past. These new texts are being set in the here and now and engaging with numerous contemporary concerns, particularly regarding criminality. Okay, so we'll move on to this, one of the key features that I just mentioned previously. So this idea of the labyrinth. So noting this layout of the city, this is what Robert Miles says about this in A Geography of Victorian Gothic Fiction, Mapping History's Nightmares, which talks about this quite in depth. So he says that the image of the labyrinth provides a model for organising a dichotomous city and for suggesting that secrets and mysteries may lurk in its darker recesses. These darker places of the city were increasingly and almost exclusively associated with its poorer districts. A closely knit collection of courts and alleys is one thing, an observable topographical phenomenon that can be charted by cartographers. A labyrinth remains a figure of speech. It carries a range of associations, suggesting secrets and anxieties, and even hinting at half-human monsters prowling its precincts. And yet, even as such urban districts were mapped and explored, the objects of social concern or reformist endeavour, so like those social philanthropists and journalists I've just mentioned, they were nonetheless subject to the poeticised figuration associated with the labyrinth. So this quote will hopefully give you an idea or a sense of what makes the labyrinth quite menacing or quite sinister kind of structure. It's in its ability to hide secrets. There is difficulty in mapping it, which creates a sense of disorientation and alienation. And of course, there's the threat of the monster at the centre. So keep these ideas and associations in mind as we look through this labyrinth-like streets in Jekyll and Hyde. Okay, so the labyrinth in Jekyll and Hyde allows Hyde to escape detection and evade his pursuers, such as Utterson imagines in this extract here. So the text shows that Hyde is skulking in passageways, mysterious doors and alleyways, and gives a sense of the chaotic layout of Soho where he lives. So I'll just read this quick extract now from the text from Utterson's kind of nightmare about Hyde. The figure in these two phases haunted over the lawyer all night. And if any time he dozed over, it was but to see it glide more stealthily through sleeping houses, or move the more swiftly and still the more swiftly, even to dizziness, through wider labyrinths of lamp-lighted city, and at every street corner crush a child and leave her screaming. Okay, so I just want you to have a think and pause the video here just to consider this question. So this is slightly more of a kind of close reading activity. So I want you to look at the language used here to describe Hyde's movements through the city. How does Hyde navigate the labyrinth of the metropolis, and why is this significant? Okay, so if you just want to press play when you're ready to continue. Okay, so if we look at the language used here, we have kind of glide and swiftly, so much that it kind of even to dizziness, it says, and it shows the ease at which Hyde is able to maneuver through this city, which obviously later on we see kind of completely bewilders someone like Utterson. It shows how comfortable he is in the metropolis, so he becomes linked to this kind of dark recess of the city, and he is at home in it. Utterson, as a result, kind of fails to trace him when we look, or struggles to trace him when he goes to Soho later to find him. So Hyde is, to extend the metaphor, the Minotaur in this labyrinth. He is one of the half-human monsters that Mal refers to. So in the second part of this lecture as well, I will be discussing a little bit more about movement and mobility in the city. Okay, so when you think about anonymity in the city, so here is Jekyll kind of justifying or sort of explaining his reason for kind of the creation of Hyde. So, okay. Men have before hired bravos to transact their crimes, while their own person and reputation sat under shelter. I was the first ever that did so for his pleasures. I was the first that could plod in the public eye with a load of genial respectability, and in a moment, like a schoolboy, strip off these landings and spring headlong into the sea of liberty. But for me, in my impenetrable mantle, the safety was complete. Think of it, I did not even exist. So I want you to again just pause and think about this question. How does Jekyll frame his desire for anonymity? Okay, so Jekyll frames this desire as quite positive. He sees it as the only way for him to be truly free. So when he's detached from this kind of stifling gentleman world of Jekyll, he is in this sea of liberty. So anonymity, of course, was not just to shield criminals from the law, but also to protect wealthy men of status from scandal and gossip. There were obvious concerns about how the secretive nature of the city, where wealthy individuals could enact their more deviant desires, could potentially lead to criminality, and kind of where that line is drawn when we're starting to make kind of allowances for people in positions of power. Okay, so just kind of talk, just another quote here to kind of talk a little bit about this criminality and this kind of criminal sanctuary that I've just referred to. So Linda Dryden states that the sprawling metropolis which breeds criminals also has the capacity to conceal them from view, as it providing sanctuary to the criminals it creates. Okay, so I want you to have a think about this extract here, okay? And I want you to think about how Hyde's economic power helps him escape the consequences of his actions, okay? So how kind of money and profit is able to help him kind of avoid this situation. I've broken this down into a couple of other questions. So obviously, after Hyde kind of tramples the young girl, we have this exchange happening, okay? So I'll just read this out now. So, we told the man we could and would make such a scandal out of this as should make his name sink from one end of London to the other. Stink, sorry. If he had any friends or any credit, we undertook that he should lose them. And all the time, as we were pitching it in red hot, we were keeping the women off him as best we could, but they were as wild as harpies. I never saw such a circle of hateful faces, and there was a man in the middle with a kind of black sneering coldness, frightened too, I could say that, but carrying it off, sir, really like Satan. If you choose to make capital out of this accident, said he, I am naturally helpless. No gentleman but wishes to avoid a scene, said he. Name your figure. Well, we screwed him up to £100 for the child's family. He clearly would have liked to stick out, but there was something about the lot of us that meant mischief, and at last he struck. Okay, so I want you to think about these questions and then obviously just move on once you're ready to continue. So how does this compare to the description of Hyde trampling the young girl, the one that comes directly to obviously before it? How can we consider monetary exchange to be Gothic, or this monetary exchange to be Gothic? And what is Stevenson trying to reveal about city life and its everyday horrors? Okay, so just going back through these questions now. So the first one, about the comparisons between the extract I've just read and the young girl being trampled beforehand. So there was a juxtaposition here between this horrific act of violence and the seemingly polite exchange, which show the terrifying callousness and apathy of the middle-class gentleman. We also have the fact that these acts of savagery were allowed to occur in these civilized spaces. So what is kind of Gothic about this economic exchange is we have these kind of macabre negotiations that are taking place in a kind of sinister, unlit street, okay? So it is very much a kind of professional arrangement. He then obviously later goes and gets a check, and then he kind of assures it and he waits till the bank is open. It's a very polite transaction for something that's really quite horrible. And yeah, so we have this crime sort of sleeping into these civilized places, but also into these seeming to be civilized practices as well. And finally, Stephen shows the horror of the modern world and the influential power of the wealthy as being regressive, or making the city appear more regressive. So the metropolis is becoming an uncivilized and unpoliced space for those who have money. Okay. So just looking at the idea of the slum then. So we're going to look at the characteristics of this kind of dual city, focusing on the degeneration of the city and the slum areas. So for this, I want to look at Soho, where Hyde resides. Okay. So Pantazar tells us this. Soho, once a relatively aristocratic neighbourhood, had, by the latter half of the 19th century, come to represent the very degeneration Hyde himself is written to embody. The area, at the time of the novella's penning, Soho had gained a strong association with prostitution, immigration, debauchery, and the much-hated French community of London, made even worse by the 1854 cholera outbreak on Broad Street. And I've got a picture of that on the slide there. Which was readily blamed on the neighbourhood's moral bankruptcy, painting it as a danger to the social body. It is a secret, ominous backdoor that leads from Jekyll's respectable house into the sinister blocks of the dingy neighbourhood where Hyde takes refuge. An ominous reminder of the dangers that lurk once one wanders away from polite society. So the idea that something insidious is hiding in these city spaces unmonitored is at the core of urban Gothic. So the dangers of these poor areas, real or imagined, were a source of anxiety for middle-class Victorians who were both fascinated and horrified by these slum areas. I say fascinated because obviously before I referred to these social philanthropists going into these areas. So it was a source of intrigue for them as well, but only at a safe distance. And as I say, sorry, urban Gothic kind of bridges the gap here. It no longer allows the reader to feel safe because it is setting it kind of in their home, just localizing it. Okay, so take a look at this description of Soho from Stevenson and consider these following questions. Okay, so I'll just read out this extract now. So as the cab drew up before the address indicated, the fog lifted a little and showed him a dingy street, a gin palace, a low French eating house, a shop for the retail of penny numbers, so the penny dreadfuls that I mentioned with Mysteries of London, which were also seen to be as really quite corrupting influence as well. Okay, and 2 penny salads, and many ragged children huddled in the doorways, and many women of many different nationalities passing out, key in hand, to have a morning glass. And the next moment, the fog settled down again upon that part, as brown as umber, and cut him off from his blackguardly surroundings. This was the home of Henry Jekyll's favourite, of a man who was an heir to £250,000 sterling. So what I want you to think about here is, what is Gothic about this description? Can you identify where traditional Gothic tropes are being transplanted into the city? So we can see from its use of fog and the dark, we create a sense of mystery and isolation, which is a traditional Gothic trope, which is being used here in urban Gothic, particularly in the work of Charles Dickens. These crowded and bleak surroundings can also be the result of industrialization, making this type of Gothic description particularly pertinent to urban Gothic. Okay, so industrialization in urban Gothic. So Emily Alder argues that late Victorian Gothic emphasises the alienation engendered by the metropolis. It also plays on the conditions of the industrialised city, the unlit streets, factories, overcrowded dwellings, and proliferation of vice and crime to produce spooky and sinister atmospheres. So if we look back at Stevenson's description of Soho, we can clearly see the influence of industrialisation on these poorly lit streets. There is still a sense of isolation in the industrialised landscape, paradoxically, even though there are numerous people in the slums. So this creates kind of a fragmented and fractured sense of community. Utterson does not know anyone there, he's a stranger, and he is vulnerable to the potential dangers of this unfamiliar district. As we saw from the descriptions of Soho previously, this was a space where people like Utterson had previously moved from, so we see urban crime seeping into these respectable areas. Okay, so just to conclude, just to give a bit of an overview of what we've talked about, okay? So we can see how urban Gothic is at work in Stevenson's novella in a myriad of different ways. So firstly, we have the structure of the city, its unfathomable layout, which creates a sense of disorder, which contributes to a type of paradoxical isolation. In addition to this, the move to the city and towards densely populated areas causes a fracture in these once closely knit communities that increases this sense of danger and alienation and suspicion. It is this which creates the anonymous criminal, hidden by the city's structures, both in its physical layout and the power structures which are designed to protect wealthy men. Finally, the Gothic slum is key to understanding how urban Gothic is used in the text, as impoverished and crime-ridden areas become the source of threat, disease, and danger. Okay, and here's just a list of my resources that I've used here in case you want any further reading and the images used. So thank you for participating in this workshop. If you're interested in learning more about what it's like to study English literature and creative writing at university, you can start with our website, or feel free to email with any questions. Thank you.